Okay. We're being recorded, so behave. All right, so by way of review, what we learned about last week, the coming of the Anglo-Saxons, they invaded what was Roman Britain. Beginning around the year 400 AD, we saw that Roman Britain had been largely Christian, but in its waning days, it was beset on all sides by invaders, right? We got the Angles and Saxons coming in from Europe. We've got the Picts coming down from what is now Scotland, and we've got the Irish raiding from the west, okay? And it's important to keep all that in your mind because we're going to talk about that again tonight. It figures in tonight's story. So the Anglo-Saxons began as raiders of Britain. After the Romans withdrew all their troops, the people left behind hired some of the Anglo-Saxons as mercenaries. The mercenaries revolted and then conquered the island of Britain, or much of the island of Britain, and settled into a bunch of independent little kingdoms. And what we talked about last week was, at the time our story began, there were 7 little kingdoms. As we're going to see tonight, there were, right before that, there were 8 little kingdoms, and we're going to talk about how 8 became 7, okay? And the important thing to remember about this period, again, because it figures very heavily into tonight's story, is that it was constant warfare among these little English kingdoms and also with the other people on the island, the Britons and the Picts. So, not 695, 595 AD, we had the Roman mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. This was launched by Pope Gregory the Great. Remember, he had seen the little blonde-haired, blue-eyed slaves being sold in Rome, asked who they were, and had it in his mind ever since that he wanted to go convert those Angles who looked like angels to him, right? And he sent a monk named Augustine. We know him as Augustine of Canterbury, who managed to convert several people and ultimately converted the king of the little Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Kent, a guy named Ethelbert. And remember, what the main theme of last Monday's lecture was why we have so many vestiges of paganism still today in our daily lives, right? Every day of the week, we commemorate some pagan god. And even in Christianity, right? Easter itself is named for a pagan goddess, right? And it all kind of goes back to Pope Gregory's strategy for converting the Anglo-Saxons, right? Keep as much of paganism as you can, make it as palatable, as, dare we say, unnoticeable to the pagans as possible, because he who wishes to climb a mountain does so one step at a time and not in a single leap, right? Gregory is playing the long game. And as we saw last week, it wasn't without its fits and starts, right? We saw that even 20 years after Christianity had taken hold, as soon as the king who converted died, people relapsed back into paganism. It hadn't taken root very firmly. And we saw Gregory had this plan for organizing church in Britain that was kind of based on his understanding of what the Roman province of Britain was. And he remembered that the 2 most important cities in the island of Britain were London and York. So he envisioned an Archbishop of London, an Archbishop of York, and 12 bishops under each of those, right? And we saw that right from the get-go, that plan never took hold. Canterbury became the mother church of England, at least in the south. And we're going to talk about York tonight. We also saw that there were religious differences between the Romans who brought Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons and the Christians already there in the island of Britain, right? The native inhabitants. They celebrated Easter on a different date. That's going to be a big part of our story tonight. And they had some different practice regarding baptism. We don't know exactly what that was, but we know that it was a difference. And we saw that Augustine did not get off to a good start with the other Christians in the island of Britain. He was kind of high-handed and turned them off. So we didn't get off on a good foot with all the Christians in Britain cooperating, and that's where we left off. So before I move on to what we're going to talk about tonight, any questions about what I covered last week? Yeah, sure.
Saint Augustine.
No, the other St. Augustine, the one that was the great theologian, lived in the 400s in Africa, right? So this is Augustine of Hippo, exactly. All right. So last week we talked about the conversion of the Southern English, if you will, Kent and Essex, okay? Tonight's story focuses on the Northern English and this kingdom called Northumbria, which literally means the land north of the Humber River, okay? And originally, right before our story began last week, there had been two independent kingdoms, one called Bernicia up in the extreme north and one called Deira, okay, in the south. And in the year 604 AD, Bernicia conquered Deira, and we get one kingdom as a result. So that's how we went from 8 little kingdoms to 7 little kingdoms. Northumbria, one of the 7, one of the heptarchy, if you will, okay? And when this happened, when Bernicia conquered Deira, the royal heir to the throne, a guy named Edwin, was driven out, okay? His brother was king and his brother was killed. Edwin is forced to go on to the land, and he's going to be the main character in our story for the next few slides. But what we end up with is in Northumbria kind of two rival dynasties that we're going to see tonight kind of jockeying for power one after another. We've got the kings of Bernicia, who were the initial victors, and as we're going to see, Edwin is going to make his claim. So we've got Edwin, the exile, okay? He was driven out of Northumbria when his brother was killed and when Bernicia turned Deira and Bernicia into a single kingdom of Northumbria. So he's wandering around and he ultimately takes refuge in the kingdom of East Anglia, okay, over here. And at this point, remember we talked last week about how there was usually one toughest king on the block kind of character, the Brett Waldo, okay? Well, at this particular time, the toughest king on the block is the king of East Anglia, a guy named Redwald, okay? So Edwin is fleeing from Northumbria. He takes refuge in East Anglia, and everything is fine for several years. And then once the guy that has taken over Northumbria has kind of gotten things under control up there, he starts sending messengers down to King Redwald in East Anglia saying, hey, I'd like to be friends with you, but I need you to hand over Edwin to me. I can't have a rival claimant to the throne lurking about in Britain. And Redwald, tells him, no, that wouldn't be honorable. But the king of Northumbria keeps at it. And finally, one of Edwin's friends comes to him and says, you know, I've got bad news for you. Redwald, who's kind of stood by your side all this time, is getting increasing pressure and threats from Northumbria, and he's going to give you up, okay? He's going to try and make peace with the Northumbrians by handing you over. So you need to skedaddle. You need to find a new place to hide. And Edwin says, you know, I'm tired of being on the run. I've got no place to go. I don't have any other friends in the island of Britain. If Redwald wants to kill me, so be it. I'm going to take it like a man. And that night, while he's in this despair, worrying about, you know, his neck, basically, he has a vision. And at this point, keep in mind, he's a pagan. Okay, he hasn't converted to Christianity, but this figure comes to him and tells him that you are going to be delivered from your current desperate situation. And some years from now, the person who delivers you from this will reveal themselves. And the way they're going to reveal themselves is through a sign. And the sign will be, they will lay their hand upon your head. And when that person lays his hand upon your head, you will know who delivered you from your current situation. So Edwin has this vision. The next day he goes and makes his appearance before Redwald and says, do with me what you will. I understand you're ready to kill me, and I'm ready to give up my life. And Redwald says, you know, I've thought about it, and I wouldn't be a good host if I did that. So instead, I'm the Bretwalda. I'm the toughest guy on the block. I'm going to lead an army into Northumbria and put you back on the throne. And that's exactly what he does. He defeats the king that had defeated Edwin's brother. And now Edwin is king of Northumbria, and the son of the guy who's just been killed, a guy named Oswald, gets exiled in his turn, okay? So we trade one exile for another, and keep Oswald's name in mind because he's another important player in our story. But for now, Edwin is back on the throne in Northumbria, and he marries a princess from the kingdom of Kent. And remember, Kent was the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom to convert to Christianity. And so she is a Christian. And one of the conditions of this marriage is that Edwin has to tolerate her faith. He has to allow her to practice Christianity. Doesn't necessarily have to convert, doesn't have to let her try and convert any of his subjects, but has to let her practice as a Christian. And she brings with her her own bishop, a guy named Paulinus, okay? So now we've got that little toehold of Christianity in the northern kingdoms through this Christian queen. And something very important, actually two things very important, happen on Easter in the year 626. Edwin receives an embassy from the West Saxon king, the king of Wessex. And this ambassador comes to supposedly pay his respects or whatever, but when he gets close to Edwin, he pulls out a knife and he attempts to assassinate. He lunges at Edwin and attempts to assassinate him. And one of Edwin's followers throws himself in the way, takes the body blow himself, is killed in the process, but he saves his king's life. And in the process, Edwin is wounded ever so slightly. He's got a cut on his arm, basically, from the glancing blow. That same night, his wife, his Christian wife, gives birth to a little girl. And Edwin, understanding that Paulinus is this Christian bishop, missionary for messenger from this supposedly powerful Christian God. So Edwin goes to him and he says, if your God really has this power, I will make a deal with you. If your God can allow me to get vengeance on the West Saxon king, the guy who tried to kill me tonight, if your God gives me vengeance against them, I will let my daughter be baptized a Christian. Not a very Christian bargain, but it's Anglo-Saxon times, okay? And Paulinus is probably like, let's take what we can get here. So anyway, Edwin leads an army down. He defeats the West Saxon king in battle and gets his revenge. So he comes back and he does allow his daughter to be baptized, but he's hemming and hawing about whether to actually convert himself. And so Paulinus realizes that he's got, his foot in the door. So he writes to the Pope, and the Pope sends a letter to Edwin explaining to him, all the promises of Christianity and all the benefits of being a Christian. But Edwin, as we're going to see, is a very, very cautious man, okay? And he continues to prevaricate. And then Paulinus puts his hand on Edwin's head and says, do you remember this sign? And Edwin thinks back to the days when he was at his lowest and he was delivered from death, right? After that vision. And so he says, wow, there really must be something to this Christian God. But he's still Mr. Cautious, and he doesn't commit right then. Instead, he summons his advisors together, okay? And the first guy that he calls is the chief priest of the pagan religion. And he explains to the chief priest of the pagan religion what has happened. What do you think? Make the case for me staying pagan. And the chief priest does something very surprising. He says to Edwin, if the pagan gods were going to smile on anybody, if they were going to give good blessings to anybody, it would be me. Nobody in this kingdom has done more to honor the pagan gods than me. And yet, here I am stuck as nothing more than the priest of the pagan religion, right? I'm not living high and mighty. I don't see more favor from you than other people in this kingdom. I don't think there's really anything to these pagan gods. I think you should give Christianity a try. Pretty shocking, okay? So he turns to another advisor. And this advisor is like a very wise, sage-like man. And he says, my king, this life on earth is like being in a hall on a cold winter's night. And inside this hall, the fire is burning. Hall's like a big room where all the guys gather together and eat and drink and tell stories. Outside, it's dark and it's cold. Inside, it's warm and there's friendship and there's camaraderie. And it's like a sparrow comes in through one window from out in the cold, flies through our warm hall, and flies out the other side. That's what life is like. Before we're born, we don't know what's out there. It's dark and it's cold. We have this short period of life where it's warm and light. And then when we leave here, we don't know what is after us. it's dark, and it's cold. These Christians are telling you there's something better on the other side. There's something better when you fly out that window. And we don't have that in our religion. So I think you should embrace the promise of Christianity. So Edwin is convinced by these advisors, and the pagan priest steps up and says, I would like to deliver this message to the people in my own way. Let them know your decision. And the king says, that's fine. And so the pagan priest goes to the most important pagan temple, and the first thing he does is he puts on armor and he takes up weapons, which is forbidden to the pagan priesthood, okay? It would be like Pastor Jeff taking an AR-15 and walking into church, okay? Probably not that strange here in Teller County, but in other parts of the country, very odd to see. So he goes in and he smashes up the idols inside the temple, and then he goes out and he gets on a stallion. And again, this is forbidden to the pagan priesthood to ride a horse. It's like now Pastor Jeff is driving around in a Lamborghini, okay? So he has totally shown the people that we're all in on this. This pagan religion is a thing of the past. So Edwin converts, and we get a little toehold of Christianity in Northumbria, but then Northumbria is invaded by the new tough guy on the block, the king of Mercia, a guy named Penda, who's still a pagan. And he conquers Edwin and persecutes the Christians in Northumbria. He's a devout pagan. And Paulinus and Edwin's widow, the Christian queen, they flee altogether, and Northumbria relapses back into paganism. So we get a couple of forgettable apostates who reign for a very short period of time, but then we get the exile Oswald returner. Remember, Oswald was the king that was, or the heir that was in place when Edwin returned and retook the throne, and Oswald was exiled at that time. So Oswald returns after having been sheltered by the Irish. So we're going to talk very briefly about the history of Christianity in Ireland to bring us up to how this is significant with Oswald. So Christianity really takes off in Ireland when Patrick begins his mission in 431 AD, right? And what we know, both from this class and from the class I taught on the fall of Rome, during the 400s, that's when the Roman Empire is collapsing everywhere, okay? In the West, at least. Britain is falling to the Anglo-Saxons. And what happens with Irish Christianity is that it develops in isolation, okay? There's very little communication between the Christians in Ireland and the Christians on the continent. There's too much chaos. So by 500 AD, 70 years after Patrick began his missions, the Irish are all in. They are enthusiastic Christians, and they even send out missionaries to convert the pagan areas of Europe to Christianity. And one of these missionaries, perhaps the most important of them, is a guy named Columba, who lives from 521 to 597, okay? And Columba is important because, number one, he is descended from one of the famous Irish high kings, okay? Ireland is a tribal society. They've got dozens, if not hundreds, of little kings, but there's always one toughest guy on the block, the high king, okay? And one of the more famous ones is Columba's ancestor. So he's got this bloodline going. Physically, he's a very imposing person. He's huge in size and he's got a booming voice, okay? So when he enters a room, everybody pays attention, okay? He studies under various of the famous masters there in Ireland, including a guy named Saint Ninian. But he falls afoul of Saint Ninian, this famous teacher, this famous Christian learned man, in a very strange way that kind of makes you scratch your head about Christianity in the Middle Ages. But Columba borrows a copy of Ninian's Gospels. Ninian has this very prized possession. He has a book, okay, which is an extremely rare thing at this time. He's got a copy of what are called the Vulgate Gospels, the Latin translation of the Gospels that St. Jerome had written back in the 400s, or translated back in the 400s. So he loans his book to Columba to read, and Columba makes a copy of it. And apparently this really ticks off St. Ninian. They fall out over this. You copied my book? Okay. That's what happened. So he's kind of made an enemy of one of the main Christians on the island. And then he makes another misstep. One of the high king's enemies comes to him seeking the right of holy sanctuary. Protect me in your church. And Columba does this. And this guy had run afoul of the king by killing somebody during a hurling match. Okay, and hurling is like the national sport in Ireland, still is to this day. So basically they were playing a game and he got too rough and killed somebody, okay? So he makes an enemy of the High King by taking this guy in. The High King's men come, they barge into Columba's church and they take this guy, violating the right of sanctuary. So now Columba is enemies with the High King. He's made an enemy of Saint Ninian, and he's got this thing looming over his head, this guilt that he allowed this guy who he was supposed to be protecting, that he's allowed this guy to be taken captive by the king's men. So Columba decides, I'm going to leave Ireland. And what he does, because again, he's a devout Christian churchman, he decides to found a monastery on the island of Iona, which is in that kind of netherworld between Scotland and Ireland. And in fact, at this time, this is the period of time where the Irish are starting to conquer Scotland. Remember, the people in Scotland are the Picts at this point. Well, the Romans named for the Irish, what they called the Irish was the Scots. And at this particular time, we've got this kingdom called Dalriada, which spans Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. And Columba is a relative of the king of Dalriada. So the king of Dalriada gives him this little barren island to found his monastery on. And this monastery of Iona is going to become a very important Christian center, even as remote as it is. So Columba founds this monastery, and then he decides he's going to become the apostle to the Picts, who are still pagan, right? And the Picts still occupy that barren, hilly area of Britain that is now Scotland, the Highlands, okay? So Columba travels throughout this desolate Pictish land, but he manages to convert the Picts because, number one, when he shows up, right, he's this huge guy with this booming voice. People just naturally pay attention to him. But he impresses the Picts through his toughness. He is able to get along in their harsh environment, unlike any other outsider they've ever seen. And his humility, right? He practices Christian humility in front of them. He's basically just preaching the good word to them and manages to convert a number of the Picts. But while he's doing this, he regularly returns to Iona. And as he's setting up little churches throughout Pict land, the mother church continues to be Iona. So to the point that it really becomes kind of the hub of Northern Christianity. Like I said, it's the mother church to a lot of little monasteries that Columba founds, a lot of little churches that he establishes among the Picts. But it also becomes a sanctuary for noble fugitives and exiles, right? It's protected, it's in the ocean, it's a holy place, so they can have this right of sanctuary. So it kind of naturally becomes this place where people who are on the land go and hide out in Iona. And the most famous of these people is Oswald, okay? The guy that Edwin had exiled. So Oswald, of course, was a pagan when he went to Iona. But what happens when you spend a bunch of time living among Christian monks? They're going to convert you. So Oswald converts to Christianity, and during his exile, he's probably also fighting wars with the Picts and with the Irish. You know, he's hiring out his sword. So he's making friends among the warrior class of the Picts and the Irish. So when he wants to make his claim for his father's throne that had been taken from him, he's got an army at his disposal. Pictish and Irish adventurers, guys who are willing to go and fight on the promise of what Oswald might be able to offer them if he's victorious. So on the eve of battle, Oswald the Christian, remember he's now fighting pagans. The Northumbrians have relapsed into paganism. So Oswald erects a wooden cross on the eve of battle, okay? And this is going to be a battle of Christians versus pagans in hindsight, okay? That's how people are going to portray it. The fact that he erected this cross is going to be significant down the road. It shows that the Christian God gave him the victory. And the guy that he defeats is Penda, the guy that had killed Edwin, okay? So Oswald is now king of Northumbria, and the first thing he does is he sends back to Iona and says, I want you to send a missionary so I can start to convert the people of my kingdom to Christianity. So the abbot up in Iona sends him a missionary, but this guy proves to be a total failure. He's a real jerk. He doesn't do a good job of explaining Christianity to the people. And pretty soon Oswald gives him his walking papers, sends him back to Iona and says, tell him to send me somebody better, okay? So then they send this guy named Aidan, and Aidan is just what the doctor ordered in Northumbria. He asks Oswald to allow him to set up kind of a base of operations, a monastery, a place where he can operate out of, but also kind of retreat from the world as it becomes necessary. And Oswald gives him this little island off the coast of Northumbria called Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne is going to become almost as important as Iona, okay? we're going to talk a lot about Lindisfarne tonight and next week. So Aidan sets up his base on Lindisfarne. And the thing about Lindisfarne is it's only an island like half the time. It's one of those, it's like Thanet, where when the tide comes in, it's an island, okay? When the tide goes out, there's a causeway you can walk to the mainland. But as we've seen, Irish Christianity developed in isolation from the rest of Christianity. And as a result, the Irish or the Celtic Church uses an outdated method for calculating when Easter is. The rest of the Christian world has agreed on a different methodology for calculating Easter, but the Irish never caught up with that, right? They were isolated and behind the times. There was also apparently a difference in how they do the tonsure for their monks. We don't know what the difference is, but that was something that they did differently. So Oswald's son, a guy named Oswy, right? Oswy, in an attempt to unite the two ruling houses of Northumbria, marries Edwin's daughter. This was the little baby girl that was born on Easter and that kind of led to the conversion of Northumbria in the first place. Now, of course, Edwin's daughter, who is a Christian, had been converted the Roman way. Okay, she was raised by Paulinus, who had come from the south, and they're celebrating a different Easter, even in the royal household. The historian Bede tells us that when the king was celebrating Easter, the queen was still celebrating the Lenten fast, okay? So that would be pretty strange, right? If you and your spouse celebrated Easter on different days, okay? And then their son precipitates a crisis. He had set up this monastery at Ripon, and it was populated with these Celtic monks, but he had become enamored of this guy named Wilfrid. And Wilfrid was originally a Northumbrian by birth, who had actually studied originally at Lindisfarne and had been raised in the Irish Christian tradition. But then Wilfrid went and visited Rome, visited Gaul, and he realized that everywhere else in the world, they're doing things differently than the Irish do it. So when he comes back to Northumbria, he is a Roman Christian. And so Oswy's son, remember Oswy's parents, or Oswy and his wife, have the house divided. Oswy is Celtic Christian, his wife is Roman Christian. Now Wilfrid, a Roman Christian, has convinced the son, go all in on Roman Christianity. And so what the son does is he boots all these Irish monks out of Ripon, and he gives the monastery to Wilfrid and says, run it the proper way, like a Roman monastery. So the king realizes we've got to sort this out once and for all, right? Our kingdom is divided between two different variations of Christianity. So he calls a synod, a gathering of all the churchmen in Northumbria to debate and convince him one way or another which way the kingdom is going to go. This is held at a town that is now called Whitby, okay? So the Synod of Whitby is kind of a big deal in the early history of the Christian church. So at this synod, we basically got two different opposing sides. On the Celtic Irish side, a guy named Bishop Coleman. He's the bishop up on Lindisfarne, right? The Celtic Christian foundation that Aidan had founded early on. And on the other side, we've got our friend Wilfrid, okay? A Northumbrian native, he knows the people. He was trained as a Celtic Christian. He knows how they think, but he's also been trained the Roman way. So he's got the benefit of knowing exactly what his opponents are going to argue. And as we're going to see, Wilfrid is pretty much a jerk, okay? So Colman gets to give his side of the story first. He says, the way we've been practicing Easter is a long established practice in our church. It goes all the way back to St. Patrick, the holy St. Patrick. And don't say anything bad about St. Patrick. And he cites the authority of the Apostle John, who celebrated Easter in this same way. And he calls the Apostle John the disciple most loved by our Lord. So he's played a pair of kings here. Wilfrid lays down a couple of aces. You're going to cite St. Patrick and St. John. I'll raise you Peter and Paul. They are the ones who celebrate it our way. And furthermore, I have traveled the world, and I can tell you that everybody in the world celebrates Easter the way the Romans do. And this is a quote: the only people who stupidly contend against the whole world are the Irish and their partners in obstinacy, the British and Picts, who inhabit the two most remote islands in the ocean. The whole giant world, and you guys stuck up here on your little dinky cold islands at the edge of the world think you can tell us how to run Easter. So Wilfrid goes on to demolish Colman's argument. Colman cites the Celtic saints, all these holy men, and Wilfrid says, no doubt they're holy, but they were primitive on this point. They did not fully understand. You can still be holy and be wrong. And then Wilfrid pulls out his hole card, plays the coup de grace. The Pope says this, and remember what the Gospel of Matthew tells us: thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. I give you the keys to heaven. Peter is the heavenly gatekeeper, and his successors are the popes. So now King Oswy has heard both sides, and he gives his decision. Very importantly, inasmuch as St. Peter is heaven's gatekeeper, I will obey his commands in everything. Otherwise, when I come to the gates of heaven, there may be no one to open them for me. So again, the Petrine theory has carried the day. So Colman goes back to Iona, where he can practice Christianity and Easter his way. Wilfrid becomes the bishop, and he moves the bishopric from Lindisfarne to York, which is what Pope Gregory had in mind. And most importantly, the English church is united under the authority of Rome. So we talked about Lindisfarne, and I want you to keep Lindisfarne in your mind because it's going to be very important next week, right? It had been founded by St. Aidan, the guy that Oswald brought in from Iona to establish Christianity in Northumbria, and it becomes a renowned center of learning, almost as important as Iona, okay? One of the most important pieces we have from the whole medieval period are the Lindisfarne Gospels, and this is one page of the Lindisfarne Gospels. Every single page is like this, where the words are not just scrawled onto a page, every letter, every word is a work of art in the Lindisfarne Gospels, okay? And this is the kind of high level of learning and accomplishment that is taking place there. So keep Lindisfarne in the back of your mind for next week. Just like the Irish had embraced Christianity enthusiastically and then became missionaries to the rest of Europe, so too do the Anglo-Saxons, okay? In the 700s, we get a history of the English people written by a monk called the Venerable Bede. And Bede gives us not just the history of Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons, but indeed the history of the Anglo-Saxons themselves. And he tells us where they came from, this continental homeland. And that lets us know that even though it's been 200 years plus since the Anglo-Saxons had invaded Britain, they still feel this kinship with people back on the homeland, back on the continent. And so when they decide they're going to be missionaries, that's who they go and minister to. The Anglo-Saxons go back to their ancestral homeland in northern Germany. And Bede tells us, take pity upon them, the Frisians, the Saxons, the Angles back on the continent, take pity upon them, for they themselves are saying, we are of one blood and one bone with you. They still feel this really strong kinship and this drive to bring the good word to their ancestral home. And as we saw in my last class, the Pope's forgery, one of the most important of these missionaries operating in the 700s is this guy named Boniface, who's busy converting people in the wilds of Germania on the eastern edges of the Frankish kingdom. And Boniface, remember, had begun his missionary activity by visiting Rome. And the Pope made him not just a bishop, but in fact his legate. And so when Boniface goes back up into the Frankish wilds, he's converting pagans, but he also helps to reform the Frankish church along Roman lines. So they're bringing the Frankish church more into line with the way the popes and the Roman church does things. And as we saw, when Pepin wants to overthrow the ancient long-haired kings, the Merovingian dynasty, he uses Boniface as his intermediary because he knows Boniface is in tight with the popes. And this all goes back, this Anglo-Saxon connection to the papacy goes back to the fact that it was Pope Gregory who led the mission to convert them. And you can see that the papacy has converted the Anglo-Saxons to Roman Christianity, and now the Anglo-Saxons are bringing Roman Christianity to the rest of Europe. Pope Gregory's investment is paying humongous dividends in terms of not just the number of Christians converted, but the power of the papacy. So that's what I have for tonight. Next week, this is what we will talk about in our next 2 sessions on Anglo-Saxon England. A rather turbulent period in Anglo-Saxon history when they get visited by some people from Scandinavia. Any questions about what I covered tonight before I turn you loose? Can we do it again? Well, I will put it up on YouTube. So
Good.
welcome to sit through it as many times as you care to. Well, thanks very much for showing up tonight. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm going to, I will miss next one live, so I have to watch it YouTube, but when my ancestors come over.
When your ancestors, well, your ancestors class went the other way, right? They conquered Eastern Europe or raided Eastern Europe. What were you gonna say?
An established monastery.
You can still visit there, but as we're gonna see, it goes through some rough times when the Vikings come. Okay,
Schedule a day trip, $65. Just to go see that.
All right.
you just got to get to the place where the ferry launches from, right? Okay.
Landis Farm Castle and then Landis Farm Priory, what's that?
A priory is a part of a monastery. It's if a monastery has multiple, outposts, if you will, the abbot is in charge of the whole thing. And then at each little outpost, there's a guy in charge called a prior. So this means that the monastery on Lindisfarne is kind of an appendage of a bigger monastery elsewhere.
And I guess you said that sometimes this is all.
Right. It should be travelable, traversable part of the day.
There's a hotel.
All right.
Let's book the trip. If you guys pay my way, I'll give you a guided tour. How's that sound?
Well, that'd be a hoot.
Well, thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Thank
We'll see.
you.
Thank you, Mike. Great job as always. Yeah,
Thanks, Mike.
thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Safe travels, Angela and class.
Thank
Thank you.
you.